Hi, today we're taking notes on solving equations using the square root method. These equations will have an x squared in them. These are called quadratic equations. Until now we've been doing linear equations because they just have an x, no square. So once they have a square on them, they're now called a quadratic. So this is your first glimpse of quadratic equations. These are pretty basic quadratic. Later in the year you'll see more complicated ones that will take more complicated methods. Okay, so what is a square root? Well, it's the number multiplied by something, and that equals the number under the square root symbol. And there's a good vocabulary word for square root symbol. So does anybody know the number multiplied by, and you should be trying to think of it or writing something in with a pencil so you can erase it, even though you can take notes with pen. Right now might be a good time to use pencil. And the word is the number multiplied by itself. How many of you got that right? How many of you came up with itself? Okay, so a number multiplied by itself equals the number under the, anybody know what that square root symbol is called? It's right here. It's called, the actual vocabulary word is called the radical. Some people say radical sign. So right here, write radical. R-A-D-I, that's an I-C-A-L, radical. So this is saying the number what number multiplied by itself equals that number under the radical. So what number times itself equals 9. Now this is a little tricky. A lot of you probably went, oh, well, 3. But technically it's plus or minus 3, because if you take 3 times 3, 3 times itself, it equals 9. But also if you take negative 3 times itself, a negative times a negative equals positive. So it's actually this little symbol plus or minus 3. So what would be the square root of 36? Write that in right here. Fill in your blanks. See if you can fill those in. If your teacher, if you're doing this in class, your teacher can pause it. If you're doing it at home, give it a try. You can pause it if you want to. And the answer is, hopefully you said plus or minus 6. Because 6 times 6 equals 36. And negative 6 times negative 6 also equals positive 36, or just 36. So what is the square root of 81? And hopefully you get said plus or minus 9. Okay, so now you have the basics. We're going to solve some equations, and a square and a square root are inverse functions because they undo each other. Like addition, subtraction undo each other, multiplication, division undo each other, square and square root undo each other. So guess what? If we have to get the x by itself, oh, it's right here, to undo the square, we square root it. And then what happens is the square root and the square undo each other, but what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we square rooted that side, so you have to square root this side as well. And then this becomes x, and this is the square root of 16, and the square root of 16 is, write your answer here, plus or minus. Notice there's two answers, just like kind of like absolute value. So it's plus or minus 4. Now let's look at this a little bit closer. Why does the square root and square undo each other? Well, let's look at 4 squared. It's 16, right? Well, what if I square root it? Guess what? Back to 4. And in this case, it could be, we could say plus or minus 4 squared would be 16. Square root it, and then it's back to plus or minus 4. So it's like you square it, it turns to 16. You square 16, it turns back to plus or minus 4. So you undid what you did to begin with. Okay, here's your steps for solving using the square root method. Okay, the first step is isolate or get the x squared by itself. So isolate, which means get it by itself, isolate x squared. And then step 2 is undo the square using, I'm just going to use a little arrow, using a square root. And this is a radical sign in case you don't recognize it. Or square root. Okay, maybe I can make that square root a little better. Hopefully you made yours a little better. Let me do that for you now. Let me do it in black so it kind of stands out. Hopefully that looks a little bit more like a square root. Okay, so we need to first isolate the x squared. That means we have to get it by itself. So we got to get rid of this minus 49. So hopefully you're saying in your mind, oh, you just add 49. That's easy. And then these cancel, and you get x squared equals 49. And then how do we undo a square? Square root. So if you do it to one side, I'm going to change to red. Square root, square root, square, square root. Cancel out, you get x equals plus or minus, sorry about the dog, plus or minus 7. Okay, this is my professional recording studio here. Okay, not. Okay, so plus or minus 7. Make sure you do the plus or minus. Make sure you get 2 answers. So if we plugged in plus or minus 7, we would get 49 minus 49 equals 0. Okay, example 2. Okay, again, we have to, step 1, isolate the x squared. So we're going to minus 36. Minus 36. X squared equals a negative 36. So now we square root both sides. I always put a little thing right here to show where it stops. You don't have to do that. Okay, so the square and the square undo each other. And now square root of a negative number. So what number times itself equals a negative 36? Tricky. Well, any number, including a negative times a negative, will equal what? And hopefully you're saying a negative times a negative is a positive, right? So and a positive times a positive is obviously a positive. So can this ever happen? Oh, this can never happen. It's kind of like the absolute value, empty set, no solution. Okay, so the kind we're working on right now, there's much more complicated kind of square roots, but these are the ones we're working on in your practice right now. And that's the end of the video. Thank you. Talk to you later.